Please put your hands together. All right. Hey, guys. How are you all doing?
Doing good, thank you.
Yeah? Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Michael. And Andy. I like you guys too.
Is that you speaking or the thing behind it?
It's me. My phone is charged, so we're all set today. And we just have a couple of questions to ask you guys. Now, no pressure to answer every single question. If you have something that you would like to add, please feel free, but please don't feel pressured to answer every single one. Cool? All right. So, Shayla, we are going to start off with you, actually.
Okay.
Seeing as I'm fangirling. Anyway.
I've never had someone fangirl about me. I'm really flattered, actually. My first one ever.
I usually do a better job at hiding it. But you are part of an organization that has actually been experiencing or doing a lot of work in relation to cultural changes. What has been the most surprising thing that you've seen that has changed over the past year in Canadian culture?
I think the most surprising thing is the change in youth work in the country, truthfully, with teenagers. I think the next generation of Christians that are coming up are some of the most exciting, committed, passionate people. What we're seeing in the youth culture change in Canada is that actually those Christians that have decided to follow Jesus that are in high school are taking steps of faith that we didn't see in the millennial generation in much greater number to say, how do I reach my friends? And I think that's just a curiosity for us to say, my goodness, I never expected that the group behind the millennials is saying, I'm taking responsibility for my high school. I want to make a difference. I want to reach people. How do I do that? Help me do that. They're looking to their youth pastors and other groups. And so I just think that's very exciting. So I think we have a generation coming up behind the millennials that we need to watch very carefully and be excited about and champion them. They're going to actually lead the rest of us in the passion for people coming to know Jesus and societal transformation. That's what we're learning right now.
That's really cool. Michael, Andy, have you guys seen any things that stand out to you over this past year in your respective ministries?
Well, I work a lot with young adults, and one of the things that I've heard from them that has been very interesting and encouraging, is they've gone through a lot of challenges, and their faith is continually challenged, and they're seeing the kind of culture that they're living in. And one of the things I hear from them is they say, you have to be all in as a Christian these days. Like there's no halfway. And what I'm seeing is a lot of young adults really stepping up and saying, I am 100% for Jesus, and even though I'm feeling a lot of pushback from my culture, I'm still going to stand up for Christ and move forward. And so I've been very encouraged by what I have seen amongst our young adults.
So I'm wondering how you guys reconcile that with some of the really exciting numbers.
Depressing stats, Michael?
The exciting numbers that I like. I'm the glorious guy who got to tell you that everything is going wrong. It's just like, great job. And maybe to layer on top of that, difficulty with a touch of a bright note. At Cartas we have a lot of questions of where we are culturally. Are we in a secular age or are we in a post-secular age? And what does that mean for our contexts? One of the bright things of that, I'll just give you an Ottawa example. I remember 25 years ago, when I would hang around in Ottawa, it was a fairly regular thing to be a Christian. If you're in Ottawa right now and you're a Christian, good chance you are. Because it has no economic benefit to be a Christian. It has no political benefit to be a Christian. Matter of fact, but the cool thing about that is the bond in the body of believers is a very different bond today than what I would have experienced 25 years ago. And maybe that's more about my own kind of personal relationship or something like that. But I think there may be a generalization to make out of that. But I'm still wondering in this question, how do you reconcile that kind of excitement that you're seeing in young people? It's not that I'm not seeing it. I struggle with where the numbers are at.
Well, notice I didn't say numbers. I don't think Andy said numbers either. So that might be some of the nuance.
But you talk about a lot. There's just like a lot of these people.
Yeah.
And me, the poor listener, is going, a lot of these people. I'm not seeing a lot of these people out there. Matter of fact, I'm meeting less of them. They may be more intriguing. They may have a really kind of animated understanding of what it means to be Christian. They may even be more able to communicate with vibrancy what the gospel is. I actually think that.
Yeah.
But I think there's less of them.
Yeah, I would
a lot
agree.
less of them.
I actually don't disagree.
And the lesser is getting lesser and lesser.
But they're getting more. What I think
is that the
I'd say.
case? Is that like, or
You guys are liking this, aren't you? We're pushing back and we're like disagreeing. No, I actually think you're right, and Andy will probably make a comment as well, but it is lesser and lesser, but what that lesser and lesser becomes is a more nuanced, committed, passionate. And so when we talk about numbers in terms of how many people are trying to reach their public high school, you know, if there was 400, let's say, in the last 6 months, just for Alpha Canada's work, not including all the other great work that's being done by youth pastors and youth leaders and volunteers, etc. But if you just take our little small number, that's maybe, I don't know, 1,500 kids. So we're not talking about a lot. But what we're trying to say is there is something about them that we're noticing that is deeply passionate about evangelism in a way that we did not see anywhere else in the last 15 years. So I'd say it's not the high numbers, it's the depth of commitment that we're seeing. That's what I'd say. Andy.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on to it, and I'm sure many of you have felt the same way, is although maybe there were more in the past, were they actually committed or were they just there? You know, and what I'm finding is the ones that we're in working with, they are committed. They're 100%. They're not on the back. You know, they're not on the back seat. They're participating. And so I see I guess a qualitative difference there with the kinds of young adults.
Andy, may I ask Andy?
Go ahead.
Suddenly the panel's taken over
Andy,
the panel.
Strategically, when you kind of think about a theory of change around that, so you have a smaller group of players who are more animated and potentially actually maybe more spiritually gifted than, let's say, kind of the assumptive Christianity that we could have potentially lived off of in previous generations. How does that play out in terms of how you think the future? How is this small little group that may have really unique gifts given to them by the Holy Spirit in a time that's much more secular than ever? How do you think about that from a theory of change into the future? How can you stay animated and excited about being in Canada and saying, hey, the Holy Spirit, God may be working in this country in some way that, well, how? With this smaller group rather than this kind of mass understanding of, you know, everyone just assuming that we're Christian.
The thing that keeps going through my mind, and I was seeking to try to bring that up in my talk, is doesn't that sound a lot like the first century? You know, this is what the early church experienced. And what did they do? Well, they were united together, and they loved people, and they, you know, shared the gospel. And they did so boldly, even though it cost them. And I guess I see it the same way. And in fact, I guess that's why I stay so optimistic about the future, is because I see the more secular our culture gets, the more novel Jesus is. And I believe the more that we're going to see people come to faith. If anything, it's that awkward transition before where you've got people that are on the fence, you know, that are just kind of lukewarm, is, I think, even more challenging than when they just are just full out secular.
That's really interesting because, Grace, one of the things that in public square life... Okay, I'll shut up. Yeah,
It's not you, Michael.
Actually, the three of us should just have a dialogue for the next 2 hours. We'd really enjoy that, wouldn't we?
I was going to suggest lunch. I would love to have lunch with all three of you. No, this was really like cool to watch, and also my warm culture playing in because I never interrupt my elders, ever.
I just feel much, much older. Much, much older.
But you actually put us in a really cool trajectory talking about change and the things that we have to think about as organizations as our culture moves towards a more secular understanding, a more, I wouldn't say hatred, but distaste for faith. How would you guys, in your different organizations, how do you lead your teams because you get to see the changes that are happening and you want to move your organization in a way that would meet those changes. How do you lead your teams, your staff teams, the individuals that you work with as you move towards change? Is that...
Could I just start there? And maybe I just want to come at it from a little bit different perspective just quickly. This is something God's been teaching me, and that is that I don't think we really understand the word secular as we talk about our culture moving more secular. And that really became clear to me when I started doing my PhD in the UK at Aberdeen in Scotland. I anticipated going there and meeting just, staunchly secular people, and what I found was very spiritual people. In fact, my first day at campus at Aberdeen, they were having a New Age bazaar, like selling crystals and different stuff. They're at the campus. And one of the things I noticed when I would walk through the streets of Edinburgh, that you could go on different ghost tours or everything else. I mean, they're actually quite spiritual. And I'm finding the same thing to be true here in Canada. They're actually quite spiritual. It's just different. And I think it's one of those things that we really, as leaders, need to be listening to. What kind of secular are we talking about here? Because I assumed it was more of an atheistic secular. And as the numbers continue to show, people are still interested in God, but it's looking different. So I think we need to be paying attention to that.
Go ahead.
Just to get directly to your question, at Cartas, it's a couple things. It's posture. It was really interesting after I spoke to someone, I forget, Donna picked up the language of posture. Number one, the mission of the organization can cover a lot of the sins of the leaders. So I am just so happy that Cartas has a really, really powerful mission, because it just covers a lot of the sins of the leaders, that they're animated by the vision. That's number one. So being able to bring the people in to be able to kind of see over top of me and see what it is that our mission is still really, really, really powerful. But how that plays out in the public square, and I think Christians need to think about this a lot. We're struggling with this every single day. And the way I'm trying to frame it now, on the one hand, Cartas as a public policy think tank that's rooted in a Christian tradition, yes, there's no two ways about it. We have to oftentimes defend the faith. Argue for things that saying, hey, no, if you're going to travel that road, trouble is going to come our way. That's actually not a really good idea. This way of organizing family, or this way of building an economic system, is not going to be God-honoring. It's not going to be flourishing. That's kind of a defending the faith. Like, you know what? You're going down the road of trouble here. And sometimes it needs to be said. That touch has maybe a touch of more of a prophetic voice. On the other hand, if we do not contrast that, if we're not able, and if we're not creative enough to contrast that with what I call imaginative Christianity, those really cool things, like, i.e., loving your neighbor is the coolest thing. Especially your neighbor loves it when you love your neighbor as yourself. It's a really, really handy thing to have. Well, what does that actually mean organizationally? It means that we're going to think about and talk about how faith-based organizations in urban spaces are absolutely amazing. And we're going to kind of show it. We're going to take pictures of it. We're going to write reports about it. We're going to show that the ideas of trust, me trusting you, and a handshake works, and behind that handshake is full meaning and philosophical foundations about who you are as a human person and who I am, is actually the root of any kind of economy that's going to work over a period of time. Really, really imaginative Christianity stuff. Pragmatically, if we can't play in this space as an organization, and if our team can't do it, if our researchers don't think in these ways, then I'm fearful that the gospel of Christ is going to be presented in a certain way that doesn't reflect the true beauty and goodness of God. It's going to show me as an angry Christian because this is no good, or it's going to show me as someone who's got little integrity and deep rudder because I can't identify the kind of traditions or directions that are maybe not good ones to travel. So we're always fighting, trying to get that balance. Speak to defending the faith, but also speak to imaginative Christianity. And Christianity, especially, Andy, I love how you said it, Christianity right now, like, it is the coolest thing going. We got a lot. The kind of robust view of who we are as humans in the eyes of God, the fact that God created us, no one can outsell that.
So here's a question for you, Shayla. You talked a lot about being in a place of change, having to move your organization towards very drastic change to meet the needs of the society at that time. How much did you involve your staff, your teams, in the process of change as a leader working down or working with them?
You know what? We're small enough that I can involve quite a bit of staff. So even now, we're going through a big change again. I really think, when will we not be going through change? It will be always happening. At least as I'm the leader, we will always be changing because we're just trying to adapt to what's happening out in the culture, but also what's happening in the church in Canada. And so we're always about change. But I would say the few things, I think you mentioned it, the vision has to be bigger than the leader. You said overcome the sins of the leader, but overcome the talents of the leader, the skills of the leader, all of that. The vision has to be bigger, and that's what motivates the whole team. But I would say that bringing them along, I'm always talking about the larger transformational vision that isn't just how many alphas do we have in Canada? Like, that's just like, blah. Like, I mean, that's wonderful. Donors really like that. But actually, our gut ache is more people to know Jesus. And when we talk about that and how do we influence the culture, how do we become people that are living that out in our day-to-day reality, not just in our 9-to-5 work, is the change that we're trying to bring out. So we want to see all of our staff be radically hospitable in their neighborhoods. We want to see them having people in their homes and meeting their neighbors and really engaging with people outside the church. It's very hard for professional, vocational ministry people to actually stop hanging out with Christians. Like, that is it's hard because you do your work with the Christians, you make friends with your colleagues, that's what you're spending your time thinking about, and then you're like, okay, now I gotta raise my eyes above that and say, who are my neighbors, who are my friends from university that I know that aren't Christians? Like, that's where we are always saying to our staff, are you engaged with the culture around you in your volunteer work, or is it all your local church in Alpha Canada? If that's the case, that's a problem. And they will very quickly lose the vision because they'll just be about, I work at a good place, or I like, hey, we're doing good work. I want them to say, no, I'm about my neighbor I know who doesn't know Jesus. I understand the questions they're asking. I understand their heartbeat for the community. That keeps them impassioned and visioned and willing to change because they know the culture is changing, because they know the cultural people in that place.
Just following from that last question, because sometimes change is hard and there's tensions there, right? So what would you say to someone who is feeling hurt or unheard from feeling their leaders are going too fast in the change process, or they haven't been involved in the change process? How does one move forward from that?
I think that, when you're feeling hurt and disappointed in leadership, you have to decide, do I trust them? I think the number one question, and I love the book Speed of Trust, written by Covey, because we actually have to decide, the larger your organization, you have to decide, can I trust the leaders, even if I don't understand their rationale for making these decisions? If you can decide you can trust them without knowing, you can never know all the reasons someone has to make a decision. Sometimes it's illegal for people to tell you why they made it. Sometimes it's not helpful for the organization. You have to think through all of that as a leader, making decisions. And so if you're on the other side thinking, well, I'm not the leader, I'm looking up and I'm hurt or disappointed, you have to say, do I trust them? Because if you can trust them, then you can say, okay, I'm going to walk in this by faith. I'm going to speak well of them. I'm going to believe and go forward. But if you've actually been hurt, your responsibility is to go to them, say, to your direct report or your team and say, I've been hurt by this and I'd like an opportunity to speak. The last thing I'll say about change and team dynamics is get in front of it, not behind it. So for those of you who know you're about to bring change to your team or to a broader part of the organization, get ahead of it, not behind it. And what I mean by that is understand how your whole team responds to change. We use the Berkman, other people use other tools. The Berkman can tell you who's going to like change and who's not going to, and who you need to be slower with and who you can move fast. I have people in Alpha Canada that if I say we're changing, they're saying, right now, okay, let's move. And others who will say, well, we'll see if this is going to work. We saw change the last time, didn't work. And you know who are those people because you bring them along at a different pace. And so I would say the biggest thing with change management with a team is knowing who your people are and who can take that, how they take it, and how you move forward with it. But we're small enough to engage as many people as possible, and most organizations try and do that. But I think as a person who's reported to people in bigger organizations, I report to a board, I report to an international board, there's many times they make decisions I don't understand, and I've had to choose trust and remember my calling. My calling is to be here. God's put that person in leadership. I'm going to trust them and walk with them. I'm not going to throw stones. even though sometimes I want to.
Thank you. So question for all three of you, or two of you, or one. Stop laughing at me, guys. So all three of you work in spheres where you're often mobilizing people, often speaking to large groups of people. How do you manage to keep a humble heart, keep your eyes fixed on Christ, have your relationship with God be your priority? Especially being in vocational ministry and like it's your job to be Christian. But like, how do you keep your eyes fixed on Christ?
I think Shayla answered a good chunk of that in her talk. Suffering does help. If I look at how I operate at Cartas, number one, my spouse is still the most credible critic, encourager to me by far. The beauty of being able to be a husband and wife and have those intuitions about both your strengths and your weaknesses and the nature of your spiritual life and your relationship to God is just absolutely powerful. It's just the joy that God created from the beginning of this world, and it's wonderful to live that out. Add to that a few people in your organization who have no fear of you is just brilliant. The amount of times I get taken down at Cartas is absolutely, it's huge. But you know what the benefit is that I can be really, really creative because I'm depending. My colleague Ray Pennings, who I've worked with for, ever since we started Cartas, he, kind of laughs. He says, I got one job at Cartas, and it's basically to tear down 9 of Michael's 10 ideas. And I don't like him, put it out there. We've been friends for years, but just because we're friends does not mean I like him. He tears down 9 of my 10 ideas, and I can tell you those 9 ideas are good ones. He just thinks they aren't. There's a beauty about that. And after a while, I think to be able to gain the confidence, though, Shayla, I was listening to you this morning, and I was kind of nearly about to cry because I'm going. I lost my son nearly 6 years ago, actually 4 days from now, July 28th. My son Kenton drowned, and we were the perfect little family. The husband and the wife and the 3 children, and my wife loved me, and I loved her, and our children. It was just the perfect little kind of Canadian family, and then our world completely fell apart, and kind of like hell came into our life. The suffering of that has introduced all kinds of brokenness that I never understood in anyone else. Coming out of a Dutch immigrant community, my interpretation of mental illness was just get up in the morning and work a little harder. That will solve the problem. Well, guess what? When your son dies and you have to deal with despondency and you have to see it in your family, then all of a sudden that kind of Dutch immigrant work tradition just isn't helpful enough. Then on top of it, you start learning to see it in others. And you start looking for it in others. And then you start asking for it in others. And when you're asking for it in others, there's just a natural humility that God will give in your heart if you at all love them. It's just the simple, it's the way it is. So that kind of reference about suffering, yes, there's a certain kind of boldness that comes out of that. Because I am not my own, but belong to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, end of story. And here's your example. You're in the hospital. Here's my example. My son dies. There's a boldness, but there's also a kind of connection to other people that you go, oh man, my kind of pride has not been able to see who they really are as people. So all the time I'm now struggling because I'm looking to try to find what's behind people's eyes. The amount of business people, Shayla, I don't know how you deal with it, but I spend a lot of time raising money for Cartas. The amount of time I've sat in front of business people and have not tried to find their heart, have not asked to look behind those eyes and find out what's going on, I'm embarrassed by it. I'm just completely embarrassed by it. And right now, for the last 5 years, I've been trying to go, no, I'm going to actually look beyond. Even it's going to cost me asking a question that's uncomfortable to them. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's just why. And God gives us this beautiful gift of beautiful relationships, way deeper than you would ever imagine.
Andy?
Well, along those same lines, I would just say that God has had me on a constant diet of humility pretty much my whole life, not my choosing. But it's interesting how God prepares you, I think, for leadership and in leadership, wanting to invite that. For example, I'm dyslexic, and so that's something I've had to deal with my whole life. And so, exactly, right? And you're like, Lord, really? You want me to do a PhD? Come on. But I mean, I've had to develop a thick skin over the years. I mean, there were a long time that my wife would do a lot of editing on papers that I would write. Now I've moved beyond that, and I have like a professional editor that looks and tears up all my work, you know. And in developing a thick skin from that, man, has God taught me a lot over the years from that. But one of the things that I've just learned from an organizational standpoint is in our organizations, in our teams that we lead, making sure that we are building a community that can be honest with one another, that can actually give you real feedback, and that you aren't defensive to that, and that you have a trust that's built there where you can take that. For example, at Northview, a church I pastor at, it's kind of a long story. I do Apologetics Canada and I pastor at the same time. When we preach a sermon at Northview, we will do something called a preview and a review. So we will together talk about the passage and the direction you're going, but after you've preached it, we'll sit down and you'll be critiqued by a team of teaching pastors. That's painful. I call it soul spanking. You know, but man, is it good for you, right? And I think that we need to have those sorts of communities that we trust that can give us that kind of honest feedback. Man, is it helpful, and will it'll help you as you continue to lead and grow as a leader.
And I'll just say very briefly. Did I lose? Oh, there we are. I'll say very briefly as we end. Model being the one willing to receive the feedback. Don't start by modeling giving feedback. Right? We err on that side very easily, and I say, as the leader in your area, model that I'm ready to receive it. And the hardest thing for any person, particularly me, is not to justify, is to actually listen and say, thank you for telling me, even if I think you're so wrong, you don't understand. But instead, when I say thank you, and I go away and pray about it. So we have to model it. And then the second thing is you actually have to revisit it organizationally on a regular basis. We just did this at our strategy team retreat a week ago, and we realized that pride had creeped in organizationally, and we saw it, particularly in me. They helped me see that. And what we did was we actually got on our knees after a very long discussion and covenanted together, 10 of us, to say we will call it out in love with one another. And we will do that quietly, one-to-one. We won't do it in a group in front of all the staff, but we will just start to remodel it again. And because sometimes your language gets lazy and you suddenly realize, oh, you sound really arrogant right now. And if we do that internally, we know it'll catch us and we'll be repentant people. And so we've said to one another, we are accountable to one another for humility as an organization. It's hard. It is really hard, but it is really, really good.
Thank you to all three of you for being honest, for your insight. You can actually listen to more of their insight, their perspective at the ministry labs that will be happening after the break. Each of the speakers will be hosting one of these, and you can ask your questions. You can hear more about their experiences, about the ways that they're moving forward, but also the ways they've seen God move as they remember and as they look forward. So thank you, guys. It's been an honor.